You're listening to Love and Libido with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamia. The goal of this podcast is to educate and inspire. My hope is that you will learn tools to create connection and cultivate passion, both within yourself and in your relationships. Here's what's coming up on today's episode. Have you ever struggled to reconcile how your faith affects the way you feel about your sexuality? You're not alone. This is the third of a 3-part miniseries on sex and faith. While faith isn't the focus of this whole podcast, it is something that impacts the way so many people feel about their sexuality. And I thought it would be great to open season 2 with a deep dive into this very common dilemma. If you haven't listened to the first episode of this series when I interviewed Reverend Dr. Beverly Dale, be sure to go check it out because we discuss some important principles that will guide you as you take in all the important information in this episode. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Sara Nasserzadeh, an Iranian-born, LA-based sex and relationship therapist, to discuss some truths and lies about sex in the Muslim community. By the way, if you have a story about how religion affected the way you feel about your sexuality, I want to hear about it. As much as we learn from other experts, nothing makes us feel more connected than hearing from our peers. Visit loveandlibido.com to share your story. I'll compile them and air them on an upcoming episode. Also, if you have a general sex or relationship question, you can submit that too by visiting loveandlibido.com. I am thrilled to start my Q&A episodes. Okay, let's get started on today's episode. Okay, welcome everybody today. I am so thrilled for today's guest. I am joined by Dr. Sara Nasserzadeh, who is a world-renowned researcher, award-winning author, and a social psychologist specializing in love, relationships, sexuality, and intercultural fluency. She is a senior technical and cultural advisor to the United Nations and an elected member of the Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. In 2009, Dr. Nasserzadeh founded the Middle East Sexual Health Committee at the World Association for Sexual Health to provide a voice to advocates of sexual health within the region. In 2006, Dr. Nasserzadeh joined the BBC World Service to create and host a radio, online, and TV show that was dedicated to providing accurate, evidence-informed, and culturally responsive information about sexuality to a Farsi-speaking audience. BBC Persia named her as one of BBC's top 100 women in 2019. I love her motto, which is that we can create world peace one relationship at a time. Her most recent research was on genital practices around the world and a decade-long research project that led to an introduction to a whole new model of love called emergent love, which we're going to talk about today. She lives in Los Angeles, and I will list her full bio in the show notes along with links to her work on emergent love and her relationship panoramic inventory, which is kind of like a DIY annual wellness exam for your relationship. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I am so thrilled to have you on. So for those of you tuning into this episode, this is part of a kickoff mini-series for the podcast where I'm exploring the intersection between faith and sex and relationships. And Dr. Sara, if that's okay that I call you that.
Absolutely.
Right. She's so global and she really knows so much about everything, but I reached out to her specifically so that we could dive into the relationship between Islam and sexuality and relationships. And so that's going to be the focus for today's conversation. So, Sara, bearing in mind that Islam is a huge world religion, and of course, cultural differences play into how it's interpreted, what would you say are some general trends that you see around sex and relationship practices, particularly among Americans who practice Islam?
Well, that's a very broad question. A couple of notes before we go there. You were very kind to say that I know a lot about many things. Not really.
So I feel like the more of an expert people think we are, the less we feel like we know personally, right?
Well, the more you know how much you really don't know. So
exactly.
That's the place I am. But thank you for that. I just wanted to clarify. So I know that I joined you to speak about faith and, Islam in particular. I just want to put a disclaimer out that I am no expert on Islam or, any other religion. It's just that I had the privilege to work with various groups and study, interfaith. And so And on that note, I would like to invite people to think that when we are thinking about Christians, Muslims, Muslims, and other faith groups or religious structured religious groups, we need to really think that specific to Islam, particularly in Quran, there's a verse that talks about there are um, as many ways to explore God and be faithful to God as there are humans on earth. So if you really just capture the whole conversation that we have in that light, that will give us an opportunity to explore without feeling like, whatever that I'm saying is actually set in stone, or it has any like a golden proof, or, that. I wanted to put that also
Thank
forward.
you.
That this is like based on my experience and my understanding of the faith and the groups that I worked with.
Yes.
Now going to your question, as Muslims who practice Islam, which could be in many different ways, right? Your question is how they link that into the sexuality that they're experiencing. Is that like the question?
Yes. Like, what would you say is the general feeling about sexuality for people who practice Islam? And of course, with any religion, there are people who are a bit more orthodox and people who are a bit more progressive. And so I know that there's a wide range, but I think a lot of people hold stereotypes. And
Yes.
so part of our conversation today is hopefully to debunk some myths and shed some light on the truth. And so I do think it's helpful sometimes to start more broadly in a discussion of what trends you typically see, say, in your sex therapy practice.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, that's a big part. Absolutely. So again, before we do that, this is so annoying. Before we do that, let's put it into the context. We first talk about culture because, like a person practices their rituals or beliefs, not in vacuum, but within a cultural context, right? Even within the United States of America, our beautiful big country, there's so many varieties of cultural pockets that we are living in within the context. Culture is basically who we are. So if we really simplify it, right? And then within those cultures, there are norms that we are experiencing. Norms are what majority of people do. And it's a very different description from what we call, oh, this is normal. Is this normal? We're not talking about that. We're talking about norms, which within sociology, field of sociology, the way that is described is the majority of people, whatever that they do, that becomes the norm, right? So if we choose as individuals or as groups to go by those norms, abide by them, we receive positive rewards. If we choose to go against it, then we are punished in one way or the other. So this is no different for the Muslim communities, and a person who perceives, and some of these norms are actually imposed. Some of them are real because, everybody's talking about it, they're overt, and some of them are perceived. And within the Muslim community, in my humble experience, there are so many perceived norms and expectations that we haven't even explored, because contrary to what people believe, that many people believe that Muslims, we just label people in that box, many people don't even speak Arabic as their first language. So the common script that unites all the Muslims, regardless of which sect they're coming from, is Quran, and Quran is written in Arabic. Arabic is a very rich language. So the way that I read it, as I learned Arabic as a second language or third, fourth language, it's a very different understanding than a scholar in Arabic language. So there you can see how we get divided based on our interpretation, the interpretations that are handed to us, and also translations that we get from different parts. So that this is only within the Muslim community. Imagine that with outside the Muslim community, what would be the perception?
Exactly.
That people
Yeah.
have, right?
And so let's talk a little bit about that. What do you think are some of the perceptions of the Muslim community as it relates to sex and relationships and love and marriage?
So basically, the first thing that I hear from people is a sense of pity and those condescending atmosphere that I experience where I go to a setting, like, oh my God, that poor woman. Oh my God, that must be too hot in this summer day under that covering.
If you liked this video, drop me a like and subscribe below. Share with a friend who might find it interesting. You can also listen to this in podcast form anywhere podcasts are streamed by searching for Love and Libido with Dr. Emily Jamia. Finally, follow me across all social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamia for daily emotional and physical intimacy tips.